In our day and age, sometimes directness, being very clear about what you think or believe, can be off-putting. It can come across as blunt or rude, and worse, we can sometimes seem like we are know-it-alls, right? Don't be pushy or demanding, I think, is sort of the manner of the day. Now, next week's reading are in fact all about humility. So I'll come back to that. But this week's are actually all about the importance of being bold and of being persistent and of speaking up. The texts today are talking about persistence. We see in the reading from Genesis, Jacob wrestling with an unknown adversary, which we're led to think is God himself. And Jesus tells us about a widow who gets a dishonest judge to settle her case in her favor, not because the judge has a sudden bout of conscience, but because she hounds him day and night. In both cases, these characters, Jacob and the widow, are representatives, the representatives of the chosen people, the people who belong to God because they've been called by God. In other words, they have a vocation, which is our English derivative from the Latin word voco, which means I call. Vocations aren't just for ordained ministers. Everyone who follows God has been called by God. And these stories are telling us that following our vocations requires persistence. It requires boldness. It even requires a fair amount of struggle. You could think of it when you are told by these readings, follow your vocation, follow your calling, be persistent. You could think of it as a charge to do your duty. The adversary says to Jacob, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. There's boldness and persistence there. There's directness, there's bluntness. And for it, Jacob pays with an injury to his leg that lasts the rest of his life. The judge in the parable says, though I neither fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will vindicate her, or she will wear me out by her continual coming. I first felt the call to ordain ministry in high school, but it wasn't until years after college that I had lunch with my old rector from college, probably a decade or so after I graduated. And I said to him, how do you know if you have a vocation? And his answer to me was, it won't let you go. It doesn't go away. An image, I think, there of God wrestling with me. It still took me another decade of persistence on my part before I was ordained. Now, I'm sure many of you could describe similar stories of persistence to get to where you are today. Nothing that we do in this life of any value or of any quality is had easily. I was at a concert last night with violinists and cellists, and it's just remarkable always to watch the bowing action of a violinist, the discipline, the precision, which only is achieved by physical persistence, mental persistence, even spiritual persistence, and a fair amount of pain, anyone who's a musician can tell you. So as the people of God, we need to be persistent in our callings and persistent in what God has called us to do. And that's our profession. That's our life's work, which sometimes is also the way in which we're paid, but not always. Our profession, our vocations sometimes align with our line of work, but not always. Now, one of the things I think that gets in the way, the stumbling blocks that gets in the way of us following our vocations and our calls is we lack courage. We lack the courage to follow through. It took me 2 decades to follow a call because in part I lacked courage. I lacked the faith that I needed to have in God to guide me. I think vocation is fundamentally a spiritual idea because it speaks to something that God has put deep within our hearts, a kind of idée fixe, something that either we can't let go of or that won't let go of us. Jacob wouldn't let go of his adversary. There was something irrational in that, don't you think? Something irrational about Jacob continuing that fight and at the end refusing to let it end. Rabbi Soloveitchik describes Jacob as an untrained weakling, someone who didn't know how to fight, and he was pitted against a superhuman warrior, someone out of the Marvel universe almost, right? And the rational thing to do at this point, I'm sure any one of us would do it faced with someone like this, would be to surrender, which Jacob did not do. Instead, he fought. His was an irrational decision. And so Soloveitchik says that in that moment, Jacob became a hero, not just of Israel, but for all of those who dare to persist in the face of overwhelming odds. It takes courage to persist like that. It takes courage to continue a wrestling match that you're supposed to lose. But what is courage? Someone sent me a video late last week of a reunion ceremony of POWs from Vietnam 40 years after they had come back. I think they had been released in 1973, and there had been a dinner at the White House. President Nixon had hosted them. And years later, 40 years later, they reunited for the last time. And CBS News captured this reunion on video. And as they went through, they asked these POWs, what is courage? And one of them gave an answer that stuck with me. He said, courage is fear that has said its prayers. Courage is fear that has said its prayers. And we see some of that courage, the result of saying one's prayers, that fear transformed into courage in Paul's letter today, in his letter to Timothy, which is all about that transforming power of prayer. Paul says, continue in what you have learned. Continue, i.e., be persistent. Paul continues, preach the word, be urgent in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, and exhort. Be unfailing in patience and in teaching. In other words, it's not enough just to be persistent, but you need to be consistent as well. You can't change to suit those around you, or you can't change to suit the times in which you live. There's a persistency and a consistency that's involved. Paul continues, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths. How did Timothy face such times like that? How did he face that discouragement? How did he transform his fear into courage? Well, as the line in the old hymn goes, Jesus is the name that charms our fears. Oh, 4,000 tongues to sing. Jesus, the name that charms our fears. I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I'm not alone because other preachers have trod this path before. But I think it was Jesus that was the unnamed man who wrestled with Jacob, a pre-incarnate form of Jesus, which means something profound. It means that Christ is both the source of our callings, Christ is both the source of our vocations, and yet he is paradoxically the source of our struggle to fulfill those callings, which sounds jarring, and it may even sound unsatisfying, unless and until you come to reframe the whole idea of vocation and calling in the form of the cross, which is what Jesus calls us to take up when we follow him. Yet who struggles on the cross? Who struggles on that cross contending with the great adversary known as death, the mortal enemy of all the children of Eve? Who struggles there but Christ himself, whose whole purpose and whose whole calling and whose whole vocation was to put an end to death once and for all, and who on the night before his arrest prayed in fear so fearsome that his blood, his sweat from his pores. He prayed in fear for his courage to be transformed into faith, saying, for his fear to be transformed into courage, saying, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Fear transformed. So these readings today, these lessons teach us that we need to be bold, we need to be persistent, we need to be consistent, and we need to be bold about claiming God's blessing, claiming something that, yes, in fact, God owes us because God has promised it to us, and God does not break his promises. If God promises the blessing and it seems to be late in coming to you, demand it. Step forward. Be bold in your prayers. Be bold in your struggle and say, God, I will not let you go until you give me the blessing, it may appear to be irrational. No one may understand what you're doing. But God's call demands nothing less than a bold response. Jesus says, will not God vindicate his elect who cry to him day and night? Which is to say, who pray to him day and night. Which is to say, those of us who are praying and working to transform our fear into courage day and night. I know about the long sleepless nights. I share them, I have them too. The power to transform fear into courage comes from the knowledge that the struggles we face as we persist in our callings come from the same source as that calling, from God himself. It is God who loves us and yet who struggles with us. And that is a mystery. It's a mystery wrapped up in the cross, which is both the instrument of justice and the instrument of mercy. It is also a cruel instrument of death, which leads through death to resurrection. And so by all means, take these lessons, be bold, claim your blessing, but come back next week for the lesson in humility. Amen.